Comes out of this tale, and to share that tale with you, we have three perfectly great individuals to talk about it. First, we are thrilled to have Doug Johnson with us. Doug Johnson is a direct descendant of Charles Applegate through his great-grandmother Fanny Applegate Johnson. He's a retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Air Force and lives in Annapolis, Maryland. And he is the person who has brought back to us from the East Coast the Hen Lane fiddle, which you're going to hear. Linda Danielson is going to be playing the fiddles and talking a little bit with you today. She's a folklorist, a former Lane Community College instructor, an incredibly well-known fiddler. She has played literally the fiddle all over the world. And the person who I said only kind words about earlier, because there's only kind words that can be said about her, my delightful wife, Shannon Applegate. So join me in welcoming that's her.
Well, following Esther is a hard act to follow. But we have a story of our own pioneer style that I think might engage your imaginations. It certainly was a mysterious thing that led me in January, February of this year to go look at my old address books. I was feeling kind of glum. I was working on my novel. It wasn't going well, and I thought I'll just procrastinate creatively and go through my old address books. So I went to an old book from 1988, which was the year that Skookum came out, and I found in the book a little slip of paper that said, "Old Fiddle." I couldn't believe it. There was a phone number there. I wonder if this phone number will still work, I thought. 24 years is a long time. What that piece of paper was reminding me of was a story about a missing family fiddle. A fiddle that seemed almost more like a myth than a reality. This was a fiddle that had belonged to a gambling man named Henry Lane, or Hen Lane as he was called. Now, Hen Lane had attached himself to the Long family, and the Long family still has folks around here. There may be some Long descendants here. I'm a short descendant. Never mind that. The Long family had men who worked on their places because there were many, many single unattached men on the American frontier, and especially here in Oregon. Now, we want to remember that Charlie and Melinda Applegate here at this house had many, many daughters. I think 8 or maybe 9 of their 15 living children. And they were a handsome group of women and certainly capable and practical. And Hen Lane, who was down the road a little bit, took a shine to one of the daughters here. Her name was Harriet. Now, Harriet had a rather plain spelling to her name, Harriet. But she wanted it spelled the French way, E-T-T-E. And so when I say her name, think about E-T-T-E. That's important. There's a little lake here in Oregon called Harriet Lake. And her death was the inspiration for her cousin, Oliver Cromwell Applegate, one of the founders of the Crater Lake, that is, white settler founders of the Crater Lake country. He named a little lake after her, a little alpine lake, Lake Harriet. It's still there. But that's another story. Hen Lane took a shine to a 16-year-old girl, and he was about 30. The census records show that when he was 28 years old, he'd managed to have not too much money. The tax records at that time showed that he had $200 one year and Zippo the next year. Now, Charlie Applegate was in pretty good shape for many, many years. He was the wealthiest man in Douglas County, at least on paper. That probably meant he had a lot of cattle, and rather than a lot of cash. Well, Henry Lane ingratiated himself with the Applegate family. He'd come over, he'd help every now and again, and of course he'd bring his fiddle with him. Which brings us to the subject of this gathering and the reason that we're having it. Hen Lane would come and beguile everyone in sight, telling people he was from Nova Scotia and that he taught the boys in the family, on the Jesse side of the family, how to fiddle, and he took out his fiddle from the case. Would you? This is the very fiddle that Linda Danielson is holding up at this moment. He'd take the fiddle out and he'd tune it, and he'd play wonderful songs for the people of Yoncalla to dance to. We know that in 1861 and 1862 there was a New Year's Eve party, and we have a descendant, a Cowan descendant over here, Doris Means, who's also a cousin 3 times on the Applegate side and other sides, but we won't go into that either. That's another story. But on this particular New Year's Eve, Hen Lane took this fiddle, and maybe Linda'd give us a little.
Might well have played a tune like this.
Now, Henry Lane's fiddle, just where did he get that fiddle? Probably in a gambling game. Or was it that someone had handed it down to him? No one really knows. That's still a mystery. That is a personal mystery, how Henry Lane got it. And my cousin, Doug Johnson, who at great expense, no doubt holding that fiddle on his lap all the way from Maryland, is going to shed some light on that particular part of this story. But let's just say I'm setting the stage for some general remarks that need to be made about fiddling on the frontier, especially here in Oregon, around the 1850 times. This house, remember, they came to the Yoncalla Valley 1849. This house was built between 1852 and 1856. And the party that I was mentioning over at Cowan's was in the terrible winter of 1861 and 1862, when there were snows and floods, and the settlers were pulling the moss, the usnea, off the trees to feed their cattle. But that's another story. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Linda Danielson, who's going to fill us in on some sort of really important information about early day fiddling and just exactly what is the difference between a fiddle and a violin.
Oh, now there's an old question. They're really the same creature. You play different kinds of music on them, and sometimes if you're setting up your own fiddle, you might set it up a little bit differently. You might cut the bridge a little bit differently or something like that. But basically, you call it a fiddle if you're playing old-time dance music. You call it a violin if you're playing string quartets. And a friend of mine used to say the difference was you carried a fiddle in a pillowcase. But he was an Oregon champion fiddler, and he had one of the fanciest cases I've ever seen. So much for that. We don't really know that much in detail about fiddling on the frontier and in the early days of Oregon. We know things like the story Joe Ross shared with us a little while ago about the Lewis and Clark expedition, including 2 fiddlers, and those fiddlers performing the function of diplomats in some of the contacts with the Indian tribes along the route. And we know things like in the reminiscent essay by Jesse Applegate, A Day with the Cow Column in 1843, he says, "Before a tent near the river, a violin makes lively music, and some youths and maidens have improvised a dance." End of story. Similarly, we get just those very cryptic remarks in the pioneer journals, but at least it kind of shows us how the music fit into the migration experience itself. From the Journal of Evan McComas in 1862, May 15, came west 15 miles and encamped, lost my place here, encamped with 5 teams from DeWitt, Iowa. Laid by and aired out our things. At night we had singing, fiddling, and a dance. In the morning of 17, heavy rain. Could not start early, only drove 8 miles. So, the detail about fiddling is just fit in there, kind of incidentally. We do know a few things about fiddling on the frontier. We do know the name of very few tunes. We know the name of one of the hit parade tunes on the frontier. You all learned this one in grade school. For all the fact that we get very little detail about fiddling and the music traditions from the journals themselves, we get a little bit more from some of the family reminiscences that have turned into family legends. During the 1930s, during the WPA project, one of the things that happened was people went out to interview the descendants of pioneers. And there's a quite wonderful interview with a woman named Mary Patton Taylor. The interview was made during the 1930s. It was her mother's story, retold from an 1840s crossing of the plains. And you know how it goes when you're jotting in a journal. You're really just kind of ticking your memory to make sure that you don't forget the whole thing. But as the story gets retold, it gets better and better and better. And Mary Patton Taylor tells of her grandmother's 1848 girlhood crossing of the plains. She says, "Grandfather was religious and awful strict. He didn't believe in dancing, so Mother'd go to bed demure as you please. And as soon as she was sure Grandfather and Grandmother were asleep, she'd slip out and dance as big as any of them." And the tunes that probably were played were the ones that we still play today. There's a tune called Arkansas Traveling. And these are quick little examples, so feel free to hold the applause. I will appreciate it at the end of this. And there's a tune that particularly intrigues me. It's called Money Musk. And it shows up in several mentions in journals and family legends, and including in the Applegate family documents. Started out in Scotland as a strathspey, which is a particular kind of a dance tune that goes like this. we didn't have a whole lot of use for strathspey tunes on the American frontier, so it seems to have turned into a square dance tune here. Tell you that's considerably difficult tune to play when you turn it into a square dance tune. It was pretty easy as a strathspey, but those were the kinds of tunes that we might have expected to find played in the frontier in the 80s, or in the 60s, 50s rather, the kind of tunes that this fiddle might have played. My own's a whole lot easier for me to play, so that's why I'm doing most of the demonstration on it. But it was a rather special experience this morning to take the Hen Lane fiddle out of its case in the house and for the first time in 150 years play it where it had been played before. It was a nice moment. Well, all that was followed by the Civil War times. And do you want to take up the Buck Applegate story, or do you want me to?
Well, I think we had to stay in the Civil War just a minute because of the gold mining deal.
We certainly do. Hen Lane and some of the Applegate brothers went off to the gold mines about that time. That was also about the time that Evan McComas, whose journal I quoted, was coming across the plains. And there would have been tunes like Marching Through Georgia. There's a wonderful story that keeps recurring in accounts of the Civil War, where various encampments of the Confederate Army and the Union Army would be close enough together that they would have musical battles and trying to play and sing louder than each other. But several of those battles seem to have been resolved when somebody started singing Home Sweet Home, and the other side joined in. And it's one of three fiddle tunes that my father could play shakily, and of course became an inspiration for me to want to play the fiddle when I was a very small child. Which brings us closer to the end of the century and about time Buck Applegate was building fiddles.
Yeah, but I've still got to go back to the Civil War, Linda, just for a minute.
Sure.
Wasn't such a home sweet home here in 1861, 1862. In Oregon was, as I've said, it was the worst weather they had had in memory. And the boys were all ready to get the heck out of Dodge. They wanted to go to the newest gold strike. You know, there were sporadic gold strikes, not just the California run, but especially gold strikes to the north, the Salmon River mines. In Idaho, in the Clearwater country, the boys here in Yoncalla had heard the old stories about the mule coming out of the creek and on caked on his legs was gold. Those kinds of things. pretty soon, once again, all of the men in Yoncalla were packing up and heading north. They were heading to Idaho, and they were going down the Columbia River on a schooner.